Okay, we're all good to go now. So, hi everybody. Want to welcome A.W. Hammond to our group. So, Alex Hammond. Um, Alex was born in South Africa and immigrated to Australia as a child. He graduated as an arts law degree from the University of Melbourne, and he currently works for RMIT University and lives in Melbourne with his wife and two daughters. The Paris Collaborator, which it's not going to show properly. There we go. Which I've just finished reading. Really enjoyed reading that. So that's your third novel, and you've published two other books under the name of Alex Hammond. Your debut was Blood Witness, which was shortlisted for the 2014 Ned Kelly Award for Best First Crime Novel. In its sequence, The Unbroken Line was described as a taut and intelligent thriller. Both were optioned as a TV series, and each novel was also selected to be part of the State Library of Victoria's summer read by a panel of judges in the year they were released. So thanks, Alex, so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me, Jackie.
And just want to mention as well that thanks to Echo Publishing, if people ask a question during the Facebook Live, they'll have a chance to win a copy of the Paris Collaborator. So please type your questions and comments. So would you like to tell us a little bit more maybe about the Paris Collaborator?
Sure. So the Paris Collaborator is set in Paris, as the title suggests, in August in 1944 during the German occupation of Paris. And it tells the story of Auguste Duchesne, who's a former school teacher who investigates and tries to find missing children. And at the start of the book, we encounter him as he's looking for a missing child, and he is then later approached by the Germans and the French resistance almost at the same time, both of them asking him to find a missing person. The French resistance asked him to go and find a missing priest and a missing cache of weapons that the priest was hiding. And while the high-ranking Nazi officer asks him to, threatens him into finding or to searching for a missing German soldier. So he's caught in this double bind, this conundrum between he's working for both sides, forced by the Germans and pressured by the resistance. He's a pragmatist. He wants to survive the war, but he also realizes that, one of the few ways that he's going to be able to get through this is to investigate both these cases at the same time. And if either side discovers that he's working for the other, then his life is probably over. So that's the setup. That's the key idea behind what the book is about. But one of the things I've tried to explore in it is really create a vivid feeling of what Paris was like during that time. Used a lot of first-hand sources, looked at a lot of photos from the time to sort of really build and make a living, breathing world for the reader. And the other thing too is this moral question about collaboration and how far we might go to survive in difficult circumstances, how much compromise one would face, and that question of collaboration traces its whole way through the book. It's not just the title, the main character of the title, who's the Paris Collaborator, Auguste Duchesne, but also stories about shopkeepers or just people living in Paris. How far have they gone in terms of being a collaborator or not? If you're selling bread to Germans and you're a baker, in Paris, are you collaborating with the Germans because you're giving them food, or are you simply making a living for yourself because that's how you survive through a war? So that's the sort of moral thread that traces its way through the novel.
Yeah, I found out a really interesting theme and interesting ideas in that as well in the book. So the main character, is that based on anyone who was real?
No, he's not based on anybody that's sort of read any first-hand information about, but it sort of, this is why I sort of, as a writer of mystery stories and crimes, in this case a World War II historical mystery, think a lot about detectives and know a little, in thinking about where to write this French detective. I actually went back to the sort of roots of the very first French detective written about in fiction, who is also the first detective stories that were written, which is Edgar Allan Poe's short stories, the first of which was Murder in the Rue Morgue. And his character in that is C. Auguste Dupin. So Auguste Duchesne, Dupin means of the pine in French, and Duchesne means of the oak. So I was sort of hearkening back to that character a little bit, but then also wanted to explore some of these ideas around, you know, so while Dupin was the sort of seed in many ways for Sherlock Holmes, which I think is quite interesting, and had this keen sense of observation and could notice details and then piece together details to tell a story about somebody just by observing them. Conan Doyle acknowledges that in The Study in Scarlet, his first Holmes story. He writes and refers to Dupin. Watson talks about the French detective in Paris, Dupin. And while it's a sort of classical detective sort of trope, I also wanted to ground him a bit more in the real world. So he's suffering from survivor's guilt. He's, there's a lot of sort of contemporary psychology that we're examining in terms of him as a character. So it's not a sort of cozy mystery or a sort of classical kind of detective like Conan Doyle's or Agatha Christie. It's very much a sort of modern psychology at work behind that character. So there were certainly seeds in there from around fiction, but he's not drawn from anybody real.
And I'm interested to know, when you're writing historical fiction, how much time do you spend on research and then how much time on actually writing?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I think for me, and this is my first historical novel, it's probably going to vary depending on where I'm writing. So I know a little about the Second World War, and so I was drawing off sort of some knowledge I already had there. But a lot of the time I was sort of trying to balance, using that as a starting point, my knowledge. Read a little bit, two primary sources mostly, just to sort of give me some fuel for the fire of my imagination about what I was thinking, and then sat down and plotted the story and really structurally worked through it. And then, having established that structure, realized that I had some holes that I really need to go get some more, and then that's where I deep dived into the history. Because as you can imagine, if you get really obsessed, you can spend a lot of time researching. And, I was trying to be a little pragmatic and targeted in when I went out and researched. But there's the sorts of things that I found, and the sources I'm referring to, a lot of the stuff on the internet so well covered for these days. Like if I needed to look up fashion, there's so many vintage fashion sites that are fantastic if you need to sort of look up and research from that period of, well, and arguably earlier, because you're in a war. So I took a little liberty in terms of like these people are in a war zone, so they don't have the absolute latest cutting edge of fashion, even if it is Paris. They're sort of getting by on the fashions of years earlier. But you can research that quite well. Advertising too, of the period advertising, that's also another great source for just sort of colouring and building that world. What were the cigarettes that were available to the French, to the Germans, to the Americans, and then sort of almost have a cigarette story in terms of who's got access to and bartering which sorts of cigarettes, and when do the American cigarettes make it into Paris. And there's a bit about them cigarettes getting there before the actual American forces do. So there's a lot of interesting stuff I think that one can do from a historical viewpoint, and I really focus it in on the world building, because I'm not writing about I'm not Hilary Mantel and writing about a series of characters who are actual historical figures. There are references to them, and but for mostly these are fictional characters lived through that period. So my history is focused more on the world building.
Yeah. And when you were doing your research, is there anything that you found that really, really surprised you?
Yeah, I had immediately assumed that before I started researching it, that the Parisians would have really kept their heads down, right? Like you've got an army in there, but what I learned is that they sort of were actively resisting the Germans in just the way that they dealt with them on a day-to-day basis. what's sort of fascinating about that time is that Paris was being held up as the R&R destination for rest and recuperation for the German soldiers, and they were all told that they would be able to take R&R in Paris, and the Germans really wanted to take the city. Hitler wanted Paris as part of his demonstration of his power, because although he was German and very patriotic, it was still seen as being one of the centers of European culture, right? So they wanted to preserve the city. They wanted it to be there, available for them to enjoy and show as a sort of like one of the jewels in the crown of the German invasion of Europe. And so in sending them there, these Germans were turning up sort of on their R&R experience, sort of acting as though they're tourists around the city, but the French were resisting them in very sort of, it seems, not basic, but basic ways, like not giving them directions, being kind of standoffish towards them, not being very embracing of their presence in the city. So just little ways to alienate them. And the Germans, it had an impact. Like the German soldiers were writing back saying the French are not very welcoming to us. I mean, that wouldn't seem a surprise to me, but, and they were, sort of not really able to enjoy the city. The Louvre, the gallery in Paris, they had all the exhibitions, all the artwork that they could move. So other than some very large statues, they took it out. So, they resisted in ways that they didn't make it comfortable for the Germans to be there. On top of obviously the active resistance and fighting and battling of the French resistance, which is sort of well documented. I was quite interested in this sort of idea of how the citizens were resisting them.
No, that's certainly interesting. We've got quite a few people watching and some questions coming through. So thanks for people typing your questions. And don't forget, if you do have more questions, please type them and you'll have a chance to win a copy of the Paris Collaborator. So Geraldine's wondering, well, firstly, she says she loves World War II era and she has your book on her wish list. She's wondering if any COVID restrictions made your research more difficult.
That's an interesting question. I researched and did all the prep work and then wrote the book in 2018. So it was hard to think of a time before COVID, really. The time before COVID. But then certainly the editorial process all took place in COVID. So I remember when I first met with the publisher, that was literally a couple of days before they started locking everybody down and restrictions. So I was a little concerned that Tegan wasn't going to really be able to make it back into Sydney from Melbourne, where we met. And then the editorial process was certainly impacted by COVID, in the sense that we weren't able to sort of meet face to face. But like this over Zoom, we had a whole range of conversations, and that's one of the great things about being able to meet over technology and things like this. And when you're editing a book, you can keep things moving and progressing forwards.
And Patricia's wondering if all of your novels are historical fiction.
So the first two were contemporary novels set in Melbourne. They tell the story of a lawyer, a vigilante lawyer who is a defense lawyer, but then at the same time when he sort of is seeking out the truth, and that plays with a lot around the ideas of like the difference between law and justice. And so really it was sort of like almost like a love letter to Melbourne, although they are sort of true crime, true in the sense that they are fully crime novels, that there are murders and violence and all sorts of terrible things happening, but no, they're contemporary, set in Melbourne, and it's quite interesting. That's the difference, and one of the sort of things that gave me a little bit of imposter syndrome between writing something set in Paris and something set in Melbourne. Is in Melbourne, I'm referring to a city that I've grown up in, and I know quite. I'm writing in places that I go to, or I've seen, or I want to research a bit more as I'm walking the streets of Melbourne. With Paris, I've only visited it the one time, and so I'm having to build in a lot of my information, and think how to create that setting in a way that's drawing from those references and the photos, and so they're much different in a contemporary setting. Although I will say one of the great joys of writing in a historical setting is that there are no mobile phones, which is always the sort of, if you're writing a mystery story, a crime story, it's always the challenge of why don't they just pick up the phone and call somebody. So I didn't have that problem this time. I mean, you could pick up a phone, but you can call the building that they're in, but they might not be there. So it was a great relief not to have to factor in mobile phones in a historical novel.
Yeah. And why did you change your genre?
That was partly to explore other opportunities in terms of writing. So those first novels were with a different publisher.
Okay.
And one of the things I wanted to do was just break out a little and see what else I could do, and what else there was sort of to write. I mean, crime is something that I am drawn to as a writer, and mystery stories, but it's one of those sort of, it's almost like a genre I fell into. It's a sort of a genre I was writing. So I have a wide range of interests in terms of as a reader, and actually read less crime than other genres, just because I don't want to influence myself.
Yeah.
So, literary fiction, fantasy, science fiction, some ways when thinking about this book, as far as a genre, I was almost tackling it as if it was like, drawing from a lot of the contemporary fantasy authors in terms of the way that they evoke a world, and trying to take some notes from them. I am thinking George R. Martin, but I'm also thinking Joe Abercrombie and Scott Lynch.
And did you find one genre harder than the other to write, or?
I think definitely historical is definitely a lot harder.
Yeah.
Just in the sense that you want to do your due diligence about your historical accuracy. So I can write quite easily about a lawyer. I mean, I was briefly, practiced as a lawyer, so I have a little bit of background there. Although that novel about that lawyer was really wish fulfillment in terms of, I was never a criminal defense. That was always my aspiration when I was growing up. So I got to live through those fantasies through writing about it. So I was drawing off a sort of an understanding of it. Like, yes, there was research in the law there, but this was research in terms of French culture, in terms of history. It was a lot more challenging. It's easily the hardest book I've ever written.
Yeah, okay. And Belinda's wondering if you're working on something new at the moment.
Well, I do have we'll see how this one goes, but I do have a sequel in mind for where to take this story. And I would very much like to sort of, explore the aftermath of the French, the liberation of Paris, but also take this protagonist to Berlin, which is, I think, will also be another interesting time to write about. And there's the seeds of that, and I don't want to say too much, but there's the seeds of where I could take the second book and how to get him in there. So I'm certainly thinking away and mulling over that in the back of my mind. But I also write screenplays. So really, what I'm sort of actively pursuing at the moment is a TV series pitch. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Again, not too far from the tree. It's a thriller. It's it's sort of crime like.
And Mary and Patricia are both wondering what you like reading yourself, and I'm wondering if maybe there's something you've read lately that you want to recommend to us.
Yeah, so I think as a reader, I'm not what a publisher would like. So, because there's that word of mouth thing. When a book comes out, you want people to be reading it very close to the book coming out, and then talking about it to other readers who are passionate about reading, and then they go pick it up and they read it as well, and they talk to other readers. And I literally have, like all of us, I'm sure we do, I've got that pile of books that I'm working my way through, and then I keep adding more to it. So my great embarrassment, the new Kazuo Ishiguro book, Clara and the Sun, has just come out, and that reminded me that I hadn't gone back and read the previous and the Pulitzer Prize, the Buried Giant, so that's the last book I've just finished reading, which I enjoyed. I mean, I think he's not the kind of author I think you want to read his novels back to back. He's pretty depressed. He's what he is. So I certainly enjoyed it. Although for me, I think Never Let Me Go is my favorite of his novels.
And Patricia's wondering if you have any advice for a budding historical writer.
Sure. I'm kind of professionally, I work within sort of marketing and digital world. So a lot of what we do, we look at data and we think about how to sort of what an audience, in this case, a readership is looking for. So whenever I do sort of writing workshops, I'm often saying, start from a really pragmatic view, like try to see what other people are reading, what's being published, what's the sorts of books that are getting out there, and think about a way to write your book in a way that is not the same but similar. I think, you know, if you've got at least one, you know, whenever you pitch a novel, you know, they like for you to be able to sort of say it's sort of like A meets B. It's like, you know, this is not how I pitched it, but they said of this book, you know, they said it's like All the Light We Cannot See, which is a literary World War II novel, meets The Da Vinci Code, which is a sort of fast-paced journey through Paris and a hunt through Paris. So I would think about, you know, that side of it, how somebody might go around, and it can seem a bit daunting, but it is looking at like what's getting published and what's getting out there. And so one of the, you know, I wouldn't suggest, you know, to necessarily, if you've been a whole series of books that have been published in a very short time, you know, that have a very similar theme. I would say that the hard pragmatic advice is to try to choose something that's a bit different to that.
Yeah, thanks for that. And can you tell us, had you always wanted to be a writer?
I think so. It's one of the interests. I have this memory, and it's hard to know whether it's like I've built it and grown it in my own mind since I was young. But when I was in primary school, I had a quite an inspiring teacher who used to get us to write stories. You know, and obviously he was getting us to practice our handwriting and learn about narrative and sentence structure and all those sorts of things. It was in about grade 3, I would think. But he also used to sort of get us then to stick that story onto a cut out something from the story. You know, if it was an old boot or a caterpillar or whatever, and then he'd stick them up around the room. And I remember towards the end of that year, looking around the room and seeing that, you know, half of the stories around the room were all from me. And I think that's the point that I realized that I really loved telling stories, and it sort of just grew from there. I mean, and I was very fortunate. I had, you know, parents who were very passionate readers themselves. My mum was a teacher, you know, a great lover of Shakespeare. My dad himself is a writer. My father's father was a writer. So I sort of came from the sort of culture of where it was really encouraged, and they always supported that. So, you know, the seed was planted early. I was inspired by some teacher, and then I was supported throughout. So nobody was telling me, don't do it, whatever you do, it's not a way to make any money, which it definitely is not.
Yeah. And what did you like reading when you were growing up?
Yeah, when I was a kid, I read a lot of, I mean, I think that was the thing. I was growing up in the 80s. So I was reading there was a lot of fantasy, read a lot of British fantasy and urban fantasy. I think Susan Cooper, who wrote mostly in the 70s, but also the 80s, she was quite influential. She wrote this thing called the Dark as Rising sequence. I devoured those books. Obviously, The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings were there as part of that. So I was mostly reading within fantasy. But then as I sort of grew up, I sort of started to uncover other sort of books that I guess were maybe I'd confused for what I thought were children's books, because the children were characters in those books. So I remember reading Lord of the Flies at a fairly impressionable age, thinking that William Golding's written this thing. Had written this book about. You know, I thought it was going to be a boy's adventure where they're trapped on an island and they had to survive. I didn't know what I had in store for myself there. So I certainly think that influenced me, and then sort of drove me towards some sort of darker stuff. So Poe was reading at quite an early age. Edgar Allan Poe was quite into sort of that side of things. So yeah, and then I got into sort of gothic fiction. So yeah, sort of those were my genres as I was growing up.
Yeah. And how hard or easy was it for you to get that first book published?
It wasn't the first book I wrote. The first book I had published was probably it was the 5th book I had written. Yeah. Okay. And it wasn't, you know, for everybody who's a sort of aspiring writer. Yeah. I mean, it's just persistence and, you know, just being committed to writing and putting them out there and writing and putting it out there. I had written other books. I'd sort of been fortunate that some of them had gotten some very nice constructive rejection letters, and even a couple of kind of follow-up emails to explore the possibility of publishing, but ultimately passes. And then it was just one of those fortunate circumstances where, you know, I had some friends of mine and said, "You got to come and meet." Mutual friend had said she's just come back from New Zealand. She was working there in Penguin. You got to come and talk to her. This was a publicist, and I said, "Look, would you pass a book of mine on to everybody working at Penguin?" And she said, "Well, if I think it's any good, I will." And I'm a pretty brutal, and critical reader. And so that's how it sort of started. She did pass it across, and then it was passed on by Penguin, but it gave me an opening to a couple of editors and commissioning editors there who I said, "Can I follow up? Can I send you my next book?" And they said, "Absolutely," and that's the thing, right? So even if that first one doesn't get there or the second one doesn't get there, but you get the opportunity to follow up with somebody and send the book in, another book, it just shows that you're committed. And also what they're looking for in their perfect world, I think a publisher is somebody who's got more than one book in them. So you've demonstrated that already by sending in a second one, because they're very keen to build your career and also for them to have success with you. So it definitely wasn't a sort of overnight story.
And as you're writing, do you have some friends or family that you share writing with as you're going along, or do you rather just wait till the end? And
that's a good question. I think I used to do a lot of sharing as I was going and give out some chapters here and some chapters there. And partly that's because it's such an isolating experience. And I think that can be a really valuable experience for any writer, is to share. But I have the good fortune of having had some publishing success. So as the years have gone by, I've become more confident in what I'm doing, although, my capacity for self-critique and to self-edit and feel, like with this book, it was, I was very critical as I was writing it, which, is probably what led it to be a tighter finished manuscript. But at the same time, I'm not saying like I'm absolutely confident all the time and think everything I do is brilliant. No, like every other writer, it's a lot of sort of self-doubt over the words you're putting down on paper. But as I've gone on as a writer over the years, I've found that I have a few key readers that I will share the final book with now, and get their feedback. I used to go out to everybody, but you get all kinds of random advice. And I guess that's the thing, is like, not everybody knows how to articulate advice back to you in a way that's necessarily helpful. And then sometimes it's about interpreting that advice back and thinking, what is the essence? Maybe not what exactly that person is saying. If they said that they didn't like a character, it doesn't mean to remove that character. It's maybe, what are the things you can do if you want that character to be likable, as a more, or not even necessarily likable, more sympathetic? What are the things I can take away as a note that they didn't like not their specific instructions, but what can I do to improve their relationship with that character, if it's important that people like it, or those sorts of things. So I started by having a lot of input. I ended by, nowadays I share it the Paris Collaborator I shared with 3 readers before sending it out to handing on to my agent.
And Belinda's wondering if you have a writing routine or a favourite place to write.
I do have a routine, but I find that my way of writing is I need to take leave from my job, which I'm fortunate that I have fairly good leave conditions. Is one of the great things about working at a university. So we get like extra 1.5 weeks leave than the average here in Australia. And I'll block out an entire working week. And I will work as though I'll write as though I'm working in that week. So I will sit down and work from 9 to 5 and commit myself to a word count. It's the only way I can do it, and say, I have to hit X number of words by this end of this week in order to feel like I've succeeded where I need to be. Fully recognizing that this is the first cut of it. Like, this is just hewing the stone before you go in and chisel away through your editing to actually make it look like a sculpture. So that's my preferred approach. And in terms of where I write, I've for the first time ever, I have my own writing space. Having had children, my study got taken over by the nursery, and then I've been most of the time I spent writing on the dining room table. So now I have a study where I can go and write. But I think that's probably been a benefit to me, because it sort of forced me to focus in and be really diligent, not be distracted by all the other things around me. I know some writers who swear by getting apps on their laptops should lock them out of the internet so they don't get distracted.
Yeah.
But I'm of the belief that, particularly as we have phones and watches now, and we're only going to have more and more access to distraction. So the more I can train myself just to be focused and in the moment, and push through. It was Bryce Courtney, who I'm totally stealing from him here too. He used to refer to for him as a writer, and what his advice to writers was always to have bum glue. Just don't get out of that chair. Even if you're not writing, just stay there until you do.
Yeah. And I'm interested to know, what do you teach at the university?
Yeah, so I work actually not in the teaching staff. I'm in the we call ourselves non-academic staff, and I manage RMIT's website. So if you were to go there right now and look up RMIT's website, I'm responsible for making sure that thing runs, particularly with a mind on how we attract new students into the university. So that's where that marketing lens comes from, and the thinking about audiences. And I sort of almost see my job at university as extension of storytelling. It's just a different way of telling those stories in a different medium, which is just sort of websites. But yeah, you have to have a good way of engaging people, and you want to keep them on the site and guide them to where they need to be. Very different mode to fiction, but not
that's an interesting way though that you've explained how it sort of links together. I wouldn't have thought about that at all. And can you tell us, for you, what do you think makes a good story?
That's a good question, isn't it? Because I'm one of these people that I get 300 pages into a book and I'll put it away and not finish it. If it's a 500-page book, I think it's about balancing, posing more questions than you answer, right? Like, so always wanting to leave the person with something they want to learn more. And I think that's irrespective of whether it's commercial fiction, which is my world, or literary fiction. You want to intrigue the reader to feel like there are some things as yet unanswered, and if I keep reading this book, I will discover the answers to that question. You might not like the answers, and it might not be clean answers, but I think it's more true of mystery and crime than it is of anything else. And then I think it's also not being too contrived in the way that you write. Like, so if a story feels contrived, and by that I mean if it's too obvious where I'm being led as a reader, I don't enjoy it, as much. I want to be surprised. I want to be delighted. I want to feel as if the things are unexpected to me. That's probably why I don't read a lot of crime, is because I'm not inflating my own ego here. I feel like I can pick up where the things are going. It's almost like homework for me, I train my thinking in the way of how to write mysteries and crime. So if I feel like I'm on top of where this crime writer's going,
Yeah. And can you tell us what you like doing when you're not writing or reading?
Sure. Well, obviously I've got an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old, two girls, and they keep me very busy. And we like to get out and do things and travel a lot. Even at the moment, the challenges with COVID and everything, it's been more going on hikes and things like that. But when, restrictions lift up, one of the things that I do love to do as a pastime is scuba diving.
Okay.
I really enjoy doing that. I enjoy cooking as well. Watch more TV than I probably should. Streaming services will make it very easy for you.
Mary's question is, how many pages in your book? So I think I was just having a look, about 300.
Yeah, just over 300. 310 or something.
And is that similar to your other books that you've written?
It's not dissimilar. Yeah, I think it's one of those things where you sort of, I think, the common wisdom is certainly for most writing, you want to aim for 80,000 words or thereabouts, give or take 5 or 10 on the other side. Obviously, some other genres like fantasy and science fiction can get very big. And even some historical, actually, and historical romance, as well as obviously a key genre. They can get quite chunky. But I sort of in the way that I structure my thinking and the way that I structure my planning, I'm always aiming at that 80,000 words. Sometimes it blows over because I find I need to tell more. Sometimes I come a little short because I find I've tightened in the editing process. But yeah.
And Geraldine wonders, how much do you plot your books, and do you basically stick to that, or do you sometimes go off on different tangents?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I believe very strongly in plotting. I think it's particularly critical if you're going to have twists, if you're telling mysteries or crime or whatever, and you need to reveal things, you need to know how you're tracking. So the first thing I'll do is I'll work out what the key beats are in order to, I'll have, like in a book like this, he's trying to solve 2 crimes. So I'll work out how that's going to play. What are the points of little insights and evidence and clues Duchenne is going to find along the way for each of those 2 crimes. So I've got these plotted out here, and then I'll sort of cut them up and literally stick down on a piece of paper the order in which he moves between them and then I have another couple of beats and plot points around character and how am I thinking about his relationship with his daughter, with his neighbor, with his his close friend who's a black marketeer and smuggler. And then I'll put in little beats around that, and then look for connections, the way that I can combine moments, because you want to be sort of not just telling plot, but also telling character at the same time. So there's a story we can tell in this chapter about him discovering a clue, but also we learn more about his relationship with his daughter at the same time. And then having plotted it out, I do write it like that. But then as to the second part of that question, I find sometimes I've either made things overly complicated and I need to strip them out, and then so I need to go back and revisit that and rewrite, or I've written myself into a little bit of a sort of conundrum. And that's where, spending a lot of, percolates away in the back of my head. It's not always like I can come at the solution straight away, but a couple of days later, I might sort of arrive at some way to make that connection work a bit better. So yeah, there's definitely a bit of rewriting. And then of course, there's the editorial process. And I mean, with this novel, there was such a fantastic experience with such a great set of, so first the publisher, Tegan, and then my editor, where we sat down with, there was reworking it, and you have the benefit of their experience and insight of having worked with a range of writers across a range of books. And sometimes they'll pose questions about, do we really need this, or does this hold true for this? And so then, that's always a respectful dialogue. I mean, it can get quite passionate, but it's, I've never felt, it's one of the great remaining sort of art forms, I guess, that with as a pure art and, as an artist, visual artist, and also writing, is where you sort of do have a degree of, autonomy, and you can still be an auteur and sort of try to drive what you feel, committed to. But that being said, I mean, they were excellent points, and I said, yeah, that actually would work a lot better. And I really enjoy that collaborative process. So, yeah, you again will come back and revisit your structure as you do the sort of the process of going through with the publisher and editor.
And when you're first doing your planning for your book, do you always know the ending when you're first doing that?
Yeah, I have to, because I need to know where I'm driving myself towards. And oftentimes for me, I'll know the beginning and the end.
Yeah.
And the hard part's that middle of like, how am I going to get here in a way that's interesting? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Patricia's wondering if you read your reviews.
Yes, I absolutely read my reviews, and I read Goodreads as well. Don't think that I don't. I mean, I'm never poised getting ready to write back to that 1-star review. I did have a funny story. If you would just indulge me, though, I don't get a lot of letters, but emails. But I've got it on my author website where people can send me a little any kind of communication they want to, really. And I got an email from a librarian who'd read the novel, and she wrote, oh, look, this is, I was feeling, I'm a librarian, and I was feeling really disillusioned about some of the books I was reading recently and a bit flat about them. And then I picked up your book, and it sort of re-inspired my reading. And so thank you so much for writing. And it was an amazing email to get. It was incredibly flattering. And I felt like it sort of, it had an impact. And then I saw that she'd also given me a Goodreads review. Was 3 stars. So yeah, inspired her to read again, but also
but
3
not
stars.
Quite that's and she'd made the effort to write you
No, I do read them, and you know, some of them can be quite funny. One of my law books was reviewed by the Victorian Bar Association's journal, and the sort of cutaway. It's such a sort of Victorian lawyer type thing to write. They said this book is the perfect length for a return trip to Bali. And I had to include that quote in my old website because it was just so absurd. You know, Victorian Bar Association.
That is a bit weird, yeah. So just reminding people before we finish off, if you do have any more questions, please type them in comments and you'll have a chance to win a copy of the Paris Collaborator, thanks to Echo Publishing. While we wait to see if there are any more questions, can you tell people watching how they can keep in touch with you?
Oh, absolutely. So I've got on my website, there's a little web form. So I you know, as somebody professionally is responsible for websites, I've set up a little website that is put all my information on it as a writer, just what's coming out, where the books are. But then it's a web form you just enter and send off and everything, and it's, you know, so that's very easy to do that way. If people wanted to reach out to me, I do write back to everybody who writes to me via email. And then you know, I've got a Twitter, there's a Facebook for me, and an Instagram.
Thanks for that, and thanks so much for joining us tonight, and thanks for everyone who's joined in and the questions that people have asked.
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming. I had a great time, and thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye everybody.
Ciao.